Hi, I'm Natasha from Tank Magazine, and today I'm speaking to the artist and writer James Bridle about his new book, New Dark Age, Technology and the End of the Future. The book is published by Verso, and it tackles how contemporary technology has led us into a world of ever-increasing incomprehension. From climate change to the nightmarish world of children's YouTube, we are living in a new dark age, which requires, Bridle writes, acknowledging such contradictions and uncertainties, such states of practical unknowing, in order to move forward. It is not only technology that changes the world, but how we choose to understand it. Well, first I want to say congratulations
Thanks very much.
on your new book. How does it feel to have it out there?
It feels really good. Never even thought necessarily this would be what I would write or how I would write it, so it's kind of amazing to have the actual solid thing out in the world.
Yeah, I mean, that was my initial question for you, actually, because obviously you've worked on a number of projects, from the self-driving cars to the cloud index, and I feel like the mediums that you often use come from the nature of the project and have that interventionist feeling to them. So I was interested to know how this arrived to you as a book, and particularly in terms of the term New Dark Age. Where did that come from, and when did you feel that this needed to be in a book as opposed to the mediums of your other projects?
I mean, I've always considered myself a writer, really, first and foremost. I kind of ended up in like visual art, almost by accident, I tend to feel. And I think you can sort of tell, because I tend to accompany most of my projects with like really long essays that tend to be more comprehensible than the artwork itself. At least that's how I feel about it. So I've always written, I've always wanted to write. And I think I felt for a long time, I always thought, at some point I'm going to write something at length that's sort of about the internet and everything else. And this is the form in which it came out, kind of very much influenced by the time at which I was asked to write it. So yeah, a book about the internet and everything else could have come out in a number of ways, but sitting down to actually plot it out around the time of the last US election, around the time of the Brexit referendum, and general world events obviously had a kind of huge influence in it. So yeah, there's all kind of stories in there I could have told in various ways, but they came out in support of this particular idea at the centre of the book. And the New Dark Age title itself was a weird one. That was a phrase that once it had settled in my head, started cropping up elsewhere. I kept finding all these other kind of quotes that use this particular frame of words, but actually the first time I encountered it was in an editorial in the New York Times, which talked about the way in which climate change is affecting our ability to predict the future. And that remained, though I kind of explore various other ideas of this darkness, that's the one that's really at the start. This question of how much we can know about the world. In fact, that ability is actually shrinking.
And the book has a very psychedelic cover, despite the doomsday feel of the title. I'm just going to read it out in full. It's New Dark Age, Technology and the End of the Future. And I wanted to ask you, do you see it as a doomsday book? Because there are also, moments of optimism or at least ways forward. And I was interested to see where you see it on the spectrum of kind of positive and negative thinking.
Yeah, it's awesome that the publishers have given it this kind of incredibly swirly, candy-coloured cover, because you kind of really need that, because it is quite bleak.
I wanted to get matching nail art for today, but I failed.
Oh, I'm off to have my appointment at 2 p.m. to have the same thing done. I'm going to get it. My nails done.
You
like
should
the book.
do for the...
Yeah, I know. It's happening in 2 hours' time. That's the plan. So it has this kind of quite deep bleakness to it. And the thing is, I obviously believe what I've written, and a lot of that stuff is quite grim. At the same time, I feel it is and was necessary to get down, to think clearly about it. I deliberately avoided trying to come up with answers. That was absolutely clear from the start. It's like it's not a book to kind of provide answers or like plans for what to do next. And I think it really felt to me necessary to get down a lot of detail about the situation which I feel we're in.
And how has your own ideas of what the New Dark Age, how did that change from when you initially started on the book until now it's being released?
I think probably the biggest change in my own feelings in terms of the writing is to actually separate it out a lot from the questions of technology, which have always been at the heart of my practice. That in the end, this isn't really a book about how technology has done this thing to the world. There's a lot else at play. It really sharpened my idea of how we can use technology to talk about this thing that has kind of always been at the heart of our questions of knowledge and understanding. That, this just happens to be to be my approach to it, and to really see that. I think also to helpfully see it more in its historical context, see it as something that's, that may, fingers crossed, be kind of cyclical. So it's not like, an endless condition. I mean, that was always the point of writing, as I said, to kind of get this down, to be able to think it at all, and then so by the end sort of think about it differently.
Yeah, and obviously today is a very hot day in London, so you do emphasise climate change throughout. There's a separate chapter on climate, but I feel the ideas of weather scientifically but also metaphorically occur throughout the book. And there's one instance that really struck me at the weekend where I was sort of lying in the garden streaming videos, where it emphasised how much energy it actually uses to stream videos. I think it was an hour weekly is about the equivalent annually as a household refrigerator. And as well, Bitcoin takes about the energy of 4 households. And, in the book, you do emphasize this sort of unknowing nature and to kind of understand more about what we don't know. But I was wondering if there are any sort of, what can the sort of user/citizen do? Any practical tips? I know this is not a practical tip book, but...
The thing that I talk about in the book is, as you said, to look at particularly the history of weather prediction, how we kind of developed computers basically for 2 things, which was basically to build atomic bombs and to predict the weather. So that's kind of where all computation comes from, and that idea of the weather has sort of stayed inside computation. It also felt like it would be ridiculous and kind of stupid and irresponsible to write a book about the present condition that didn't talk about the climate. And I think that globality is something that I'm attempting to address in the book, because one of the problems with saying this is what you can do about it, is that actually individual actions have almost no effect at this scale. There's a quote that I repeat a few times in the book from the artist Ronnie Horn, where she says that climate experienced in the local is something that's experienced like as pleasure, but what's good locally is bad globally. So like nice weather actually means something bad. And this is the kind of incredible thing that climate change has done to our awareness as a result of what we've done to the climate. And so this kind of constant quest to change our behaviour kind of almost is part of what I think of as this kind of solutionist problem, rather than looking at the much bigger structures that we could actually affect. Nothing is going to happen without change at a much faster level, which means governmental change. Some people have the levers on that. If very, very large corporations in certain sectors were willing to do stuff, that would make certain distinctions, and that decision comes down to a few people, and it comes down to a few people in government. But for me, the meaningful thing that people can do is actually start to think consciously about these huge structures in which they're embedded. Your example of energy consumption being one of them. But really, I don't see a huge amount of possibility for kind of individual change on this. But there's a lot of chance for political change.
I guess when you're facing these, this kind of, like you said, unknowable immensity of what's really happening politically in climate change, you sort of reach to having your keepy cup and your reusable bag, rather than sort of reaching out and doing more kind of collective thinking and collective pressure groups, which I think is, a wonderful thing about reading your book, where, it does help you understand the scale of your own misconceptions or misunderstanding. And for me, I think one of the most surprising elements of the book was some of your previous projects that you've done, how they're, sort of data and surveillance is obviously so integrated into very ordinary and everyday places. You talk about cycling from Slough to Basildon, you talk about the Amazon factory in Staffordshire, where the workers are basically these kind of, I think you call them meat algorithms.
Well, I said they're treated as meat
algorithms. It made me also realise a misconception that I personally have of this kind of dystopia is almost like quite a glamorous sci-fi idea, which has obviously come from Hollywood, and to think that these things are actually playing out on the kind of borders of Ipswich, really...
Possibly the worst thing about dystopia is it's really boring, badly designed, just it's daily miserable, and this kind of cataclysmic thing that we think of it as.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you. Obviously must have affected how you sort of experience the landscape, and also if you do think it's relevant, on an individual basis, to be more aware of how these things are physically integrated in your environment.
That is, I guess, what I'm sort of approaching in my last answer as well is like, this is what I think people can do, is become more aware of this stuff that's kind of right in front of us. It's not about your necessary or personal behaviour, but it is the stuff that's kind of exactly around you in the world at all times. And when you start to see that stuff, it becomes, you start to understand more and more. And I just think, rather than people trying to change anyone's behaviour, I'm just trying to maybe poke people's understanding of these things. But to show them at all times that this stuff is right in front of us. And that it's sort of weirdly hidden. This example you gave of the cycle ride from Slough to Basildon, that was a ride between two data centres, so two big buildings filled with computers, one of which is the London Stock Exchange and one of which is the New York Stock Exchange. It's UK, European base. And the cycle route between those two things was to follow the microwave routes of the data that's flowing between these stock exchanges. And that data is basically money in wireless form. It's vast amounts of money travelling visibly through the air, like just above our heads. And then when you see something, as I described in the book, of these microwave dishes placed on top of a NHS hospital, which is the hospital out in West London, just close to Heathrow, you suddenly get a sense of the way in which our general inability to see the way in which technology has made, in this case, vast amounts of kind of money making possible, is used to actually remove benefits from the rest of society. This huge amount of money is right there in the air above this place, but this hospital itself is underfunded and crumbling and being used as a kind of host, like kind of parasites upon it. And that becomes super literal when you understand and can see that technological thing happening, that actually changes your political understanding. And so by telling those stories and kind of pointing out these occurrences of things like, the labour practices within Amazon warehouses or the microwave lines, so I think the way to kind of change an understanding around these things.
Yeah, and this dislocation we have from, dystopia is this kind of like Blade Runner future that hasn't infected our environment yet.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a key driver of my work for quite some time. I'm really interested in this point where it was like you mentioned my self-driving car project earlier. I mean, that was a classic example of a technology that for so long has lived in this kind of insane kind of jetpack future, and suddenly it's like a reality, and there's self-driving cars driving around. You can go and buy one. And they're going to be really everywhere soon. And they've gone
on the borders
from being
of Ipswich and Slough and Basildon.
Yeah, they're already there. And it's this thing of something that goes from being incredibly sci-fi to incredibly banal, without us ever really thinking about it. There's never a moment in which we actually address the reality of this thing and make conscious choices about it. Because this is something that's going to affect everything. The self-driving car is a herald of the kind of automation of everything. I was just reading someone's comments just before I came in about the new runway at Heathrow, and she was talking about how the fact when they built the Terminal 5 at Heathrow, they promised it would bring in an extra like 5,000 jobs. 3 years later, there's 3,000 less jobs at Heathrow, and this is because that kind of economic expansion is actually predicated on like removing jobs, and that's coming to more and more industries through automation. So the self-driving car is a kind of this incredibly powerful moment where we can actually talk about how we want automation to operate, and also how we want artificial intelligence to operate. But there's this incredibly narrow point between, as you say, science fiction and banality. So it's about like hitting them right in that moment and making them comprehensible to everyone, so that actually we can all engage in a debate about them.
Yeah, and sort of counteract these feelings of alienation as well, I guess. Yeah, I was also interested to know what the feedback... I mean, I know it's quite a young stage for the book, but what's the feedback been like so far?
I've had very little feedback so far. I mean, I think the feedback has generally been wonderful. I'm very grateful for some of the comments people have made about it. But and as expected, a lot of them people asking, so what do we do? And I think, I think that's good because actually... in a lot of ways, we've stopped asking that question because one of the consequences of this kind of alienation, the book is just a kind of analysis of that process of alienation, how that's come about, how we've kind of allowed the business of the world to kind of retreat from view, to become something that we don't really think about or believe we can understand. And actually, so just to even start to ask those questions in a way that presumes like we can do something or that we can think them, I'm incredibly happy if that's the result. That's restored the kind of actual people's agency in this discussion, which is the first step towards anything.
Yeah, I think that's something the book definitely does. I also wanted to know, I mean, you said you haven't had so many reactions yet, but what are the kind of misconceptions you think people are having about the book?
I don't really know. I mean, a lot of people see this thing, this new dark age, as meaning a kind of regression. And it's not... in terms of, I mean, but even the medieval Dark Ages were hugely misnamed. There was an incredible flourishing of arts and sciences during that time. We just don't have a lot of historical records of it, and we didn't used to. Again, we're still discovering this stuff. But it's that trying to think about how much we can understand about the present, and to say that also that it doesn't need to be a terrible thing. I do believe in this idea of a new Dark Age, and that we are entering a point where we actually will be able to predict and understand less about the world happening around us. But that doesn't have to be a terrible thing. There are historical ways and present ways in which we can address that and think about that differently. And those changes are super, super necessary to society, because they involve a true democracy of understanding. They necessitate it. We're not going to kind of lose control of society in the world. And so this is I see the New Dark Age as fully an opportunity, the place of possible hope.
Hence the cover.
Hence the cover, exactly. This is not the end of the world. It's not even a dystopia, but it is the world we're in, and we need to understand that.
Yeah, I had some confused looks when I was reading the book on the tube. It's like New Dark Age. Ooh, but it's psychedelic cover.
Yeah, totally.
So,
that's the thing. It's not a place of hopelessness, and it's not a place of impossibility. It's really a place of incredible possibility, of real actual chance for change.
Cool. I mean, that seems like a good end note. Thank you very much for your time, James.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing the book further out in the world.
Thanks very much. Me
cool.
too.
Right, thanks.
Yes.
To hear more podcasts from Tank Magazine, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.